Let's start with the first question on the screen. So we have a very clear aim of where we want to go with solar PV, and we need to do a lot of engineering to get there. But also, of course, we all do fundamental science as well. So what is your take on what should we do? What is the most pressing, the most urgent? Is it more the sort of incremental improvement of efficiency and stability, or is it really fundamental science, or is it both? So what is your take on this? And maybe I'll just start next to me and we go through the row.
Well, thank you for this question. I think I hinted already at my answer during the talk. I really believe there is a need for interplay of both. We are under these pressing circumstances often inclined to favor the efforts towards increasing the performances or more radical, what seems maybe as a more radical improvement, while often the fundamental research can provide breakthroughs that go beyond the current capacities of technology. So I believe firmly that we have to nurture both approaches and also make sure that the mechanisms are in place to ensure both.
Do you want to add something?
Yes, I agree. So I really like, for example, the topic I'm talking about, that the fundamental science, the interplay there. For silicon, for example, as a very established technology, as you showed, it actually took how many decades to get to the perfection we have. I think we have to go through the same with the new technology, especially like perovskite-based fundamental understanding. To my opinion, it just only starts. So we have a lot to do there. Every step we do, we actually increase little stability, and hopefully it's faster than silicon.
Well, I think we have. I think we have two different time frames. One time frame, next 10 years. What can happen next 10 years? And that is quite applied research. It means a chance that you do something very fundamental and it will be already out there in 5 years' time, so it can have an effect for the next 10 years is quite small. So also the fundamental thing is, of course, what comes after that. That's very important. But what I think is much more important is that we get into a mode of race. We are not in a mode of race. I mean, even here with these really wonderful application of this grant, you still have 2050, and the thing is just going up to 2050. This is too late. So I just compare it with the invention of the development of the radar. The radar was starting to be developed before the Second World War. And then people came into race mode. Well, the reason was war, but the reason could also be the climate that we come in race mode. And we do a collaboration. When you look at the history in Wikipedia of how the radar was developed, it was a huge collaboration between different countries. And just to give you one example, the polyethylene, the most common plastic, was discovered just before the Second World War. And then government said, we don't make a patent of that, because this is the only good material we have to isolate the wires, and that's needed for radar. And they actually made it in a way that they could use that instead of just patenting it. And what happens today? Today, these companies that do carbon capturing, they keep the stuff secret, and that shouldn't be allowed. So I think more important than thinking should we have fundamental stuff or applied stuff is that we get in a race. That's my answer.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe I can pose the second question there on the screen, because it came from me. So role of recycling we already discussed a little bit, because the modules that have been installed in the last 10 years or will be installed in the next 5 years will run out of time at some point, right? But maybe a bigger issue is the grid stability. And with that I mean grid in terms of technical stability, because you have volatile sources, but also in terms of market. So I remember some time ago I shared a master thesis with Wim Sinke that was about the trade of electricity, which consists of 3 levels. One is very long term, so you buy it years ahead. One is shorter term, weeks, and the third one, which along fossil fuels is very, very small fluctuations you buy on a daily basis. This market can be completely inversed, let's say, when we have volatile sources. So I'd like to have some insight into, the stability in the market, essentially. Maybe this is something for you to start with.
Yeah, well, I don't know too much about the grid. I only know that we need to have more active inverters in solar panels, because our inverters we have now are passive. They just react to the frequency, say, of the grid. And the grid is stabilized by heavy rotors, say, in coal power stations. And where close to where I live, there was a nuclear power station, and when they stopped it, they actually rent out still the generator just to have the inertia to stabilize the frequency of the grid. And that should be taken over by PV, by having active inverters that can stabilize the grid, for example. And actually technology is developed, but I think it's mainly the government regulations that still are not good enough that this is really applied. So this is often a question of the government to actually orchestrate a stable grid.
Yeah, maybe to add a comment to that. In terms of all these aspects, so ensuring the mechanisms to have both the fundamental and the applied research, but at the same time instilling the sense of urgency and the race, I believe that it's also in our role as scientists to engage not only in our research activities, but also outreach. And increasingly important to, in a way, facilitate some of these interactions with policymakers for science for policy, science diplomacy, or even, knowledge brokery, or even advocacy on some of these issues that we are not often encouraged. So I use the chance to mention this in this context, as well as it relates to the impact that was discussed earlier today, but also a question that we were posed in the scope of this network being lobbying for some of these issues to be addressed. So just to maybe add this component to the discussion, that we might need to also consider taking a step beyond the comfort of our research niche disciplines and beyond the interdisciplinarity, go transdisciplinarily in order to discuss more the issues broadly beyond the scientific and academic community.
Very nice. Then maybe that leads kind of to the last point on that slide. That is, what can people in this room, researchers, young and old, do more efficiently? Of course, we all do our research, and we all believe that it contributes to a quicker energy transition, but what else can we do? And we, of course, gave already an example, but maybe very concretely, how can we contribute beyond the research to make our research more impact felt, or also contribute in a positive way to the energy transition?
Maybe just to add a comment to this on some of the mechanisms to consider. There are scientific societies, like the chemical societies, the Dutch Chemical Society or the European Chemical Society, for example, or international chemical society like the International Young Chemists Network as part of IUPAC. So they are young scientific societies that facilitate some of these interactions, and also scientific academies that might be good platforms for further exchange and learning more about some of the programs for engagement that I want to just bring to everyone's attention.
Yes. May I add to, for the young generation, except we are being a researcher, many of us are actually teachers. I think it's also important for us to educate the young generation, even our kids, our young students, to connect the societal challenge to scientific methods. How do you actually contribute from the knowledge, from the scientific research, learn the methodology to actually connect to the society impact? And for the student side, I think it's important the students attend the event like this or be open-minded to actually have an overview. What's the challenge there? How that's connected to what you're studying, what are you good at, and choose a field that you're good at and become better at it. And don't stop interact.
Yeah, well, when it comes to perovskite, you all know it's stability that can really add more to the energy transition if we get it more stable. And I showed you a graph with economics that went flatter. Well, if things are not stable, it bends down very easily, so it's important to be more stable. That's one thing. Another thing is we are prone to get into difficult materials when we make tandem cells. That suddenly there is indium in there, suddenly we can't have high temperature while soldering in the module, so we use bismuth, which is very scarce. So a contribution is also to avoid these materials, these scarce materials, because if we keep them in, we will only have a manufacturing, say, of 100 gigawatts per year, but not more, and that is not a significant contribution to the climate. I think that's the main points I would say. So silver-free, copper, bismuth-free, indium-free. Yeah, I mean, one more thing you can do, I just want to, add to your comment, say, in my spare time, I'm with the Scientists for Future. So this is a pretty tame collaboration between scientists who try to communicate more. But if I were in Holland, I would join the Scientists Rebellion, because they do such a good job. And I mean, I'm not a person who glues myself on the road or so, but I think the Science Rebellion, they got a good middle way. That they do some sort of civic disobedience, and I think without that, we won't get a stable climate. I think it's necessary to be a bit disobedient. But yet they do things I, as a more mature scientist, dare to do. And this is what I could recommend. Why not joining the Scientist Rebellion? I mean, they make wonderful music on the street. You can take your instrument with you. You interact. It gives you motivation. It gives you direction.
I think that leads nicely to the one of the most popular questions from the audience. Should we connect more to policymaker and politics? And maybe we should add not just the should we, but also how should we connect more to policymaker and politics? Who would like to start?
I'll be happy to comment. I think it's always a delicate question, but it's a question of culture. And I think this relates to also the science rebellion or Scientists for the Future. I think we collectively need to rethink how our culture, what are the elements of our culture that prevents this? Because institutionally, if this is not recognized as something beneficial for the community or for the professional development, especially for young people, and quite the contrary, criticized as such, then we do not have the right incentives to make a difference. And this also refers to the politics or policymakers. I think there is an immense need for young people and scientists in particular in general, but also early career scientists to contribute to this decision-making process in policy in Europe or also internationally, and that there are some emerging mechanisms on how to do this. And again, I refer everyone to some of these activities of the young societies that are advocating for some of these initiatives. There are good mechanisms in Europe with a number of young associations where one can get more involved to understand better the systems and also identify some of the mechanisms on how to exchange and how to contribute. Because there is not only the need from the scientific perspectives to bring some of these issues closer to the policymakers, but many of the policymakers are also in need for these perspectives from the scientific view in order to bring the best policies at the decision-making table and truly make a difference in some of these issues. So I'd be happy to discuss this also during this conference because I'm very involved in enabling some of these mechanisms in Switzerland, but also across Europe as well.
And if you would like to add something to that? Any experiences, maybe personal experiences?
Well, I usually go to fossil companies and I help them to make a transition to renewables. And this is actually really nice work, to listen to them of what their abilities they could use for PV or wind. Say, for example, the oil platform has lots of knowledge you can use in floating wind offshore, for example. And this has been a really nice job, that when I visit these companies and talk to them, in a way motivate them to be faster, like, Schall, Total, all these companies are too slow in changing. And if I were young, I could imagine even working there in the renewable department and try to do something there. I mean, there's lots of money, there's lots of opportunities there.
So that was my question. You started with, I usually go to oil companies. I mean, that's already difficult for most people to imagine. How do you go to an oil company and talk to them, right? What's your first step? And of course, you could decide to work there, but are there other ways which are maybe less dramatic choices for your career than directly being an employer? Is there a way in? Is there an access point to talk?
Yeah, I mean, for me it's easy to go to them. When you're young, it may be more difficult. But when you're young, I mean, you can choose jobs. And you need a job, and you may decide which job has its disadvantages and advantages. I mean, there are surely disadvantages when you're in a fossil company, but there are also advantages. And wait, what's better for you? And you don't need to be there forever. If you are frustrated after a while, feel free to change. Yeah.
Yes, you said you wanted to be the rebellion member of that if you were young. But the rebellion students actually very against the researchers university collaborate with Schall. How would you, if you're in that situation, how would you do?
Yeah, well, I think Schall would have a great potential to bring the energy transition forward. It's a complicated mechanism. You would need about the stock market, as the stock market interacts with the CTO, CEO, etc. But actually, I would also join the rebellions in my age. It's not just for young people. I mean, it's mainly also for old people. But I think I'm not against Shell or Total or BP as such. I'm against that culture that they still do more exploitation of new fields. Also, if you bring out the oil of the known fields, you're already at 3.5 degrees. So it's more a cultural change I'm advocating for. And I think when you're young, you may even have more opportunities to change the culture than if you're old like I am.
These jobs are
Okay, let's see. I have other questions. So there's a question from the audience saying, if lead is going to be a no-go from a political or safety point of view, will there be a future for perovskites?
Just a brief comment from my side in terms of the European initiatives. I'm not sure how much this community is aware, but it has recently been a statement issued by the European Commission called Safe and Sustainable by Design. I'm not sure if anyone is already aware. Maybe show of hands? No? Okay, quite a few people. I realized that this might be an interesting statement to consult because it takes this perspective on what sustainable really means in Europe. It's taking a much more holistic approach. When we think about lead, there is this toxicity component and impact on the environment, but there are many other factors in terms of the scarcity of elements, but also the energy needed to produce a specific technology on the basis of different elements. So when answering this question, I'm reminded of it also to evoke all these factors when assessing whether there is a future.
Well, I think we need to distinguish whether we have a consumer good or not. Consumer goods have a return ratio of about 10%. 10% of consumer goods are collected. The rest is ending up in the waste. That's why in the EU, lead is forbidden. But for PV, it's allowed because it's not a consumer good. It actually comes back to a collection station. So when I have a normal module from Trina, from whomever, there is much more lead in the solder of today's module than there will be lead in perovskite. Of course, that lead is not water soluble, but in the perovskites it's water soluble. But if you have, say, an absorbing layer behind the behind the tandem cell, then if it breaks or whatever happens, that the liquid is absorbed and reacts to that material behind, the lead won't end up in the ground. And I think there are really creative ways to actually make it quite benign if something happens to a tandem cell. So I'm not so much worried about the lead because it's not a consumer product.
Maybe add to that, to processing perovskites is not only lead potentially are harmful, but actually some of the organic solvents. And this actually up to the scientific community to actually come up with new chemistry that is not toxic, but also friendly and also recyclable. This is quite an important fundamental aspect as well.
Yeah, sometimes surprising these things. I saw a presentation at Entropy this week on which atoms actually would be scarce, right? And of course that is a bit of a different question, but also there was really surprising which of these atoms are actually scarce and which not. So even the iodide was a little bit on the edge. So you have to be quite informed in these questions. Okay, maybe if we go to another question.
Well, I forgot what you could work on, actually, when you said about working. I forgot that we need to improve light trapping. The reason why the silicon wafer doesn't get much thinner over time, it only, say at the moment it's 170, 160, is when you make it thinner, you lose JSC. And I'm actually surprised that not so many people work on improving light trapping these days. Because when you use less silicon, the production of silicon uses half the energy of the whole value chain and it uses half of the capex. So improving light trapping for the normal silicon PV could be very good, not just in case JSC, but in what material you save. I forgot that. Sorry.
Well, that's right up our alley at AMOLF, yeah. Quite a few people already here work on light trapping in silicon, so that's great to hear. Peter, do you want to introduce the next question?
So the next question is, I think there's a growing movement against solar fields in the Netherlands. What is the best way to get society more involved and to get a building integrated, people more accepted? Because I think especially in the Netherlands there are initiatives, also designers, special designers that try to, very popular, try to make beautiful design with PV. So maybe that fits beautifully in Alan's question.
Maybe one word, outreach. I think more outreach and not only toward the policymakers, but also general public, to really highlight the importance of it. And also debunk some of the questions and concerns that sometimes come along with these initiatives.
Well, you don't need to install all of the panels in the Netherlands. You could also install them close to the border in the neighboring countries. Why not? With the Greenland, if the Greenland ice melts, the sea will be 6 to 8 meters higher. Wouldn't you be glad to have solar panels a bit further out of your country's own ground?
Okay, but also, maybe just to add one more thing that I saw, because it's beautiful. There's a solar park near the Dutch city of Hengelo. There's 2 Hengelo's in the Netherlands, a smaller one. There's a little park, which is actually a recreational park, but half the area is filled with solar panels and you hardly see it because there's sort of bushes and trees and in between you have solar panels, really beautifully integrated. It's not, of course, the optimal use of area for the solar field, but because you can have a double use for also as a recreational park, it actually is really well accepted by the people who live there. We have sort of a question from the audience. Do we allow this? I think we allow this.
I just want to add to it that there's a study from TNO that shows we have so much roof area in the Netherlands that we would effectively use it all. We're nearly done. Of course, it's hard to use it all, but then, like what you're saying, with just a little bit of land and also some water, we won't have a problem. So indeed, I think we should just stop building big solar fields and be much more careful in integrating.
I'm wondering if we are fast enough if we just stop building solar fields, but that we can maybe ask somebody who is doing this calculation.
That's the way to push it.
Yeah. Okay, maybe we should go to the next question. Besides silicon and perovskite, what material do you think is the most interesting to pursue in fundamental research? Do you have an opinion?
Yes, so silicon and perovskites are absorbers, and there are a lot of material science that still need to be done at contact layers, transport layers, or layers in between. There are a lot of new opportunity for new materials. Still, I hope that's answers some of the questions.
Maybe to add to this, I completely agree. It resonates a lot, but also when we think about perovskites in this context, I assume that people think about metal halide perovskites, right? But they are also all organic perovskites, which is something that maybe not everyone is familiar with, which is also a very exciting class of materials and an example where research can go further.
Also electrodes, the silver and the gold, they are really precious, rare elements that really need more fundamental research to replace them, but not sacrificing the performance.
Yeah, for gold also, I've heard that even with only 1 nanometer, like a recombination layer tandem cell, if it's gold, it doesn't work. If you go to terawatt scale, it will not be enough gold. So 1 nanometer is already too much, so you basically can't use any gold in a perovskite cell. We also heard earlier that chalcogenides could be an interesting material to work with. So I think there's many ideas about new materials for the next generation.
So what to replace copper? I was wondering all the time today, because you showed the copper needs are shrinking, and that's a bottleneck.
Yeah, but that's in cables, that's not in the cell.
Still, what do we do with the keyboards?
well, one way of doing it, you go to high voltage much earlier, because the overland high voltage lines are not made of copper. They are made of aluminum because of the weight, and they don't need to be as conductive as copper because it's high voltage. And we are trying to have schemes where we do PV utilities, where we go to high voltages very quick, and then we can use aluminum lines, for example, of copper lines.
Yeah.
Okay, Peter, maybe you want to go for the next question?
Okay, so sometimes in the perovskite field, it seems people are more interested in publishing impact journals, not only the perovskite field, I guess, than to join efforts to get to faster and better results, such as stability issues, something you have shown nicely this morning, right, in a journal example. Yeah, can you comment? Maybe start with that example you said, the very small area and especially the stability of a few hours, a few hundred hours, it's not enough for commercial applications.
Well, I compare it to football. When you want to play football, you need to stick to the rules of football. And if you want to make a scientific career, you need to stick to some rules. They are not so hard as in football, they're soft rules, but you need to stick to rules to publish. And this is a kind of thing that seems contradictory, but actually it's not. If you work together with other people in joint papers, and we often have many authors on our author lists, and you often have more than one affiliation in our affiliation lists and our papers, we can actually work together to make it more stable and still publish. And even then, we are maybe also well equipped to publish in a high impact journal. But my impression is when we work more in different fields together, it's harder to publish because they will order reviewers from these different fields and every one is against the other. So recently I was the first author of a Nature paper about heat pumps. We actually had interviews with people who installed the heat pumps, and we based our models on these tradespeople interviews. We had a very hard time in reviewing because the technical people say, keep the two tradespeople out, and the social science reviewers said, it's too technical. And I think it's more these kind of things that make it hard to work in a community, but not some pressure to publish as such, I would say. That's a bit my impression, my personal impression. I don't know what you think.
Yeah, maybe one comment. If it comes to stability, what you mentioned of completely different aspects, you say you need to really put it outside, for a week, for a month. Of course, it's something that maybe TNO does, but we are not having the test facilities in the lab So we need to think about completely different collaborations to actually get stability tested on the scale, on methods you needed.
Yeah, well, I can talk a bit more about how to test stability. And when I said we need many samples out, we can put them on the roof as a resistor. So at a normal light intensity, it is at VMPP, more or less. And we don't need a tracker, which is expensive and hard to maintain. And then we have a student paid to get them down every week or two and to measure them in the lab, which is actually quite cheap. I mean, you can do I mean, I don't mean that, of course, the student is cheap as well, but I mean, the setup is cheap of an IV test. And you can actually just measure, reproduce. We don't need a top IV test to do that and put them up the roof again. And that gives you much more information about your pair of skies. And if you have a few good pair of skies and monitor them all the time in a repetition rate of a minute. So that's what I wanted to say with that. And I think, I mean, even small labs have a big roof area and have space up there to put things on the roof, actually, and it's, as I say, not so expensive. If I go in more detail about what I mean.
You can show where there's 10 micron silicon cell that absorbs all the light. It's still difficult to publish it in a reasonable journal because it's considered boring.
Yeah, I can comment on that. I mean, I'm a professor at Oxford University, and there we have a nice materials group where I'm mentoring students. And that boring topic came up, and we thought about how to make it kind of sexy enough so we would get funding. And one way of doing it was that Trina gave in-kind donations to that. And as soon as you find a company who is a bit tolerant to say, oh yeah, we give in-kind donations, that means we give you cells that are not finished, or we take texture samples from you and make some cells, then the chance is actually much better to get research funding. And it's more funding for applied stuff, of course, but you can do still very basic research. And this was a project where they looked at the interaction of acids, of how they make micro nanostructures, kind of stuff. So it was very fundamental research. But as soon as a company takes it on and makes a cell of it and then shows the efficiency of the JEC, then the chances improve. So maybe collaborate more with industry on an in-kind base. And with the in-kind base, the industry wouldn't ask you for a contract that happens with IP. This was a totally IP-less contract that we do an in-kind contribution. And Trina, for example, does it actually quite often.
Okay.
Maybe think of that.
And maybe a comment in general related to the importance of publications or impact factors. And I think we there also have a responsibility as a community to really reassess our positions, especially when incentivizing some of these metrics, when it comes to the funding, the positions of people, etc. And I think in this context, this is increasingly happening, in fact, so valuing the quality of the research and the researcher over the impact factor or the journals, which are highly dependent on the field, on the circumstances, institutions. There are a number of biases. So even the European Commission, in fact, there's an initiative coming up to assess projects over the CVs of the applicants, which is something that hints at the reassessment of this. And I guess we all have to play a role in emphasizing the importance of collaborations and impact over competition and metrics that do not speak as much on the quality of that impact. So.
Yeah, it sort of highlights that the difference to the football game is that in football, FIFA makes the rules, and in science, we make the rules ourselves. So as a principle, we could change them, but we all have to work on this. Okay, do we have another question from the audience? To improve solar device performance, stability, and scaling up, what is, in your opinion, an important but ignored part of the research?
Maybe a brief comment that is now maybe coming into the spotlight slowly, gradually, but that I asked the question about is mechanical stability. But not only in the context of these pressure effects that we studied, but even just simple mechanical interfacial stability between the layers that is not, in my opinion, assessed as much as it might deserve in the context of building the full picture on the performances and stabilities.
Yeah. To comment on this, I think the stability and also scalability should go hand by hand. Even you see my research are very fundamental. When I started to think of my proposal for the VD proposal is very fundamental, very atomistic things. I still talk with TNO, with my colleagues, ask them what kind of solvent would you use if you do this log die or row to row. So take all of this into account to your science. It can be done and it's also important. Yeah.
Well, what's ignored? I look at from a perspective of entropy. When you look at entropy as order or disorder, a crystalline silicon solar cell has entropy 0. You go with fabrication to 0 entropy. There you have very few states, and that makes your fabrication quite stable, because there are not too many different entropy states within a given entropy. There are not too many states where things can go astray. This is classical manufacturing. In earlier times with amorphous silicon, they went to maximum entropy. And at that maximum entropy, you have, again, very few states. You can imagine you look at your home when you were a student before exams, and the mess gets bigger and bigger and bigger because you concentrate on your exams. If you made a photograph a day before the exams, in front of each exam, it would look very similar. Because a total mess is just a total mess, is it? You can't do more than that. So the industry went to its maximum entropy, because there you're already quite stable in manufacturing. You have very little amount of state. So when Joanna, when I listened to your presentation, I had said, but hang on a sec, in your manufacturing, in what you propose, aren't you neither at very low entropy nor are you at maximum entropy? And then you have many, many, many different states. And is there a manufacturing possible and viable when you're in between those classical extremes? And how would that go? I think that would need maybe more research. And this is maybe when they ask here what's ignored. Is that a shift of the whole manufacturing when we do things like this? I mean, I'm optimistic. I'm not criticizing what you say or what we propose, but this is something we may need to look deeper into if we are somewhere in between in entropy.
Very interesting. Yes.
Yeah, because we had a discussion over the break that I think ties in, or maybe you want to talk about it.
Yeah, sure, with pleasure. I think it summarizes in one term, following up on this, is dynamics, right? We consider or we treat these systems as very static, but they're constantly exposed to all the variety of stimuli. And I think I really appreciated you evoking the need to study these systems outdoor, but more, I would say, in real world condition, where we need to also ask ourselves, when we assess them, do we really take these dynamic factors appropriately into account when even testing these systems, but also when assessing them and then looking a step beyond to think about new strategies to address this by making the strategies dynamic as well. Absolutely. I hope this summarizes it, but maybe you want to add something.
No, I think it summarizes more or less, but the only thing that was, if you look at nature, this is super high entropy system. It's always changing, it's very dynamic, and you could say it's also super unstable, but a tree lasts for hundreds of years and is stable. So it's maybe we have to think about it a different way than the classical manufacturing. It's not concrete or steel or a silicon transistor. It won't be stable like that ever, I think. I don't believe it will. So I think we have to think of a different approach.
Kind of similar to driving.
To driving.
Okay. Then the approach is learn how to drive. You just let the system move, and you learn how to make it move the way you want. Right?
Yeah, it doesn't matter. The dynamics is there, but it's about preserving a function despite the change, right?
Yeah.
Which we see in natural systems.
Yeah. indeed. So we need to make a living solar panel.
Maybe it can reproduce itself at some point.
We change continuously, but still you look like you continually.
Yeah,
They
so
can recognize you.
the dynamic stability came up in the break.
Yeah.
Okay, let's. We have only a few minutes left. Let's go to another question. How can we speed up integration of new technology? 20 years is too long. I guess that refers to previous technology cycles in solar. How can we make it shorter? Let's start with Jorik.
Well, you may have heard of the smiling curve in economy. The smiling curve is when you design a product, you can have big revenues from it, though the curve is high. When you go to production, I mean, it's a low margin business, and that's why it's mostly in China, in Vietnam, wherever. Because people can't make much money out of that, so it drifts in those countries. So globalization wasn't really globalization. Globalization was concentration in those countries that are cheap plus organized. With those tools, you get there. And then there is a smiling curve goes up again where you sell the product. Like your clothes store earns much more than any people who uses the stuff. And when you try to actually accelerate stuff, you lift the middle part. But in the West or in industrialized countries, you only do the smiling end of that smiling curve, and we don't do the bottom. And basically what we are talking about when we say reindustrialization or bringing back PV to Europe is lifting up the middle part, and that will accelerate it, because there in the middle part is the real knowledge that gives you the power to actually accelerate an industry. It's neither in the design nor in the selling is really the important part there. That's
How do you
why-
do this?
Pardon?
How do you lift the middle part? What do you have to do?
Yeah, well, to industrialize again our near surroundings and thinking, well, it's not worth to make a product cheaper, and then lose control of it. And we can just hope that other people will accelerate the energy transition.
The trick is to find a mechanism to put value on keeping the industry local.
Yeah, well, that's what I said with Norman Lighthouse, for example, with forming a club, for example, things. I mean, with our current, what to say, capitalism or capitalistic system, we often think the capitalism is our consumer society. That's capitalism. And when I listen to the Fridays of what they say, change the system. Yeah, we need to change the system such that we pose better conditions on capitalism. So I'm not someone who says we shouldn't have capitalism, but we should really pose conditions on it that this doesn't happen, this kind of ladder, because it eventually makes suffering. It makes people suffer. And if we can kind of put some conditions on capitalism, we could actually not only reduce suffering, we could actually get more power in accelerating things again.
And maybe another component to that is definitely implementing the right policies. And for this, we need to be more engaged in both as knowledge brokers for policymakers, but also issue advocates. And I think many of these young, but also cross-generational initiatives of rebellions that bring the issue to the attention also of the policymakers are really critical there, and we can do so much more in terms of intensifying the issue advocacy as well as more active engagement with the policymakers so that the right policies are in place for this to actually happen and get implemented.
Thanks. Do you want to add something? Or?
I'm looking for the next question.
Okay. I think we have time for one more. One very short question. Let's do one more and then we wrap up. I saw on the slides that led is one of the elements should not be used as the bulk material in PV. What does this tell us about the future of perovskite? I think we kind of had that question, right?
Yeah, that was palladium.
Yeah. Oh, palladium. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, maybe then to wrap up and give everybody a chance to have a sort of a last statement. This is a good one, I think. What is your personal opinion? Do you believe that, I think this is only a belief question, and we have hard numbers on this because it's predicting the future, but do you believe that perovskite PV will make a significant dent, I guess, in the way to a sustainable climate energy system? And let's go through the road, so I start with Giovanna.
Well, I certainly have a firm belief, otherwise I wouldn't be motivated enough to drive this research forward. I think these are fascinating materials, and I also believe that there are a lot of opportunities and functionalities that are not exploited in this context. So I'm really optimistic about the research developments as well as impact it will make on this or other technologies in the future.
Yes, so I agree. I think silicon or perovskite, they are not competitors. They should complement each other. It's a marriage than actually a fight. So yeah, we should take advantage of both technology, and perovskite we need a lot more research, but I'm on the positive side. Yeah.
Well, I don't know, so just hope.
I think this is a very, very nice sort of final word. So we close the session here. Thank you very much for our panelists. It was a really great discussion.